Like the Diary of a Man in Despair, the Essays and Idleness of Yoshida Kenko is a hidden book, buried in obscurity, save for the occasional mention in the mainstream literary press. Though, unlike the former, it remains relatively well known in its country of origin, having been promoted as a classic by Japanese scholars since at least the 18th century. I bring it to the attention of this audience because I believe it is yet another obscure book of perennial wisdom that will bring those that read it to a more scholarly disposition. As a necessary digression, something I find increasingly sickening is the attention given to loud, contemporary texts of anti-modern rhetoric, promoted via the cacophony of social media, and given neither correct appraisal nor valid criticism. All the thought and rhetoric needed to build a strong metaphysical and mental wall against the errors of modernity was written well before this age. In the words of Nicolas Gomez Davila, the most subversive book in our time would be a compendium of old proverbs. In that very spirit, I present a look at the Essays in Idleness. We do not know very much about the life of Kenko. He was born in Japan, probably near the capital of Kyoto, in 1283, and died not far away in 1350. Recent scholarship has contested that the name Yoshida was posthumously given to him by the Yoshida Shinto authorities, and that the only authentic way to refer to him is simply Kenko. It is known that he became an officer of the guards at the imperial palace, but went into voluntary retirement in his middle age. The exact reasons are not clear, but this may have been due to an episode of unrequited love for the daughter of the prefect of Iga province, mourning over the death of the emperor Go-Uda, or simply a general disgust with the erroneous way he felt his societies was headed. He joined a sect of Buddhist monks and returned to his previous occupation, that of a poet. In fact, Kenko is known to have participated in several poetry competitions at the imperial court during his time there. His life after retirement was that of a rural hermit, spending his days mostly in scholarly leisure and avoiding public engagement. It was during this time that he composed the essays. As for Kenko's reactionary credentials, the essays are scattered with references to the steadily declining standards and traditions of Japanese society, although a modern reactionary will look upon Kenko's descriptions of feudal Japan with a deeply envious longing. As I will discuss later, Kenko's reactionary mind is so valuable to us because he provides an example of someone keenly aware of the aesthetic decline of a society, not just the moral and political aspects of it. He does not rail against the politicians or rulers of his day. He merely makes worrisome, sensitive remarks such as, "Nobody is left who knows the proper manner for hanging a quiver before the house of a man in disgrace with his majesty." I imagine, indeed, I hope that certain viewers will be deeply frustrated by such observations. Such people have no sense of analytic scale. As another Japanese reactionary, Yukio Mishima, said, "By means of microscopic observation and astronomical projection, the lotus flower can become the foundation for an entire theory of the universe and an agent whereby we may perceive truth. In essence, we can glean enormous knowledge and sensitivity to aspects of our societies by attention to the smallest detail." Of course, in the modern West, such aesthetic pedantry is long gone as a general virtue, but we ourselves should adhere strictly to it. Such is the way of a cultivated soul. Politically, Kenko did indeed live in what could be considered an era of decline. 100 years prior to his life, the brutal Genpei War had given rise to the Kamakura shogunate, marking the rise of the samurai class to power and reducing the Emperor of Japan to little more than a figurehead. Thus, the multitude of court rituals and ceremonies Kenko would have participated in during his time at court would have been bereft of meaning beyond the metaphysical and the traditional. It is perhaps this fact that gave rise to his patrician aesthetic tastes. Indeed, he lived at a time of effective military dictatorship, and being a Buddhist scholar, was keenly aware of various ideas surrounding the decline, as we are today. He wrote, "They speak of the degenerate, final phase of the world. Yet how splendid is this ancient atmosphere, uncontaminated by the world, that still prevails within the palace walls." In this way, Kenko was dismayed by the boorish, soldierly types flooding the capital. and so sought refuge in the now impotent but ossified monarchical institutions. So often have I seen this sentiment repeated by educated reactionaries, I think we can safely coin the maxim that a true reactionary is he who yearns for the cloister. Interestingly, although the essays have long been held in high regard, the exact origin of their publication is unclear. A 16th century scholar posited that Kenko did not compile the work himself, but rather jotted his observations down on scraps of paper and posted them on the walls of his cottage. It is then said that a servant collected the papers following his master's death and gave them to Imagawa Ryoshun, a fellow poet and friend of the late Kenko, who served as a general in the local armies. They were henceforth compiled into an ordered book. The weight of modern criticism has decided against this theory, owing to the careful and deliberate manner in which the essays are arranged, but the fact that the oldest surviving copies of the work were found in the possession of one of Ryoshun's students seems to lend it some credence. The work is structured as 243 separate essays and a short preface. Some of the essays go on for pages and relate complex stories, whereas some are simple aphorisms or anecdotes that barely reach a few lines. Some are philosophical reflections, some wisdoms on life, and others are blunt, practical advice for living in the 14th century Japan. Of the latter, perhaps my favourite example is, you should never put the new antlers of a deer to your nose and smell them. They have little insects that crawl into the nose and devour the brain. There are two widely accepted translations of Kenko's work in English. The most modern version was published by American professor Donald Keene in 1967 and is considered definitive. I personally much prefer the translation by Sir G.B. Sansom of 1911. Sansom's Edwardian language better captures the often grumbling and officious, but still humorous and humble tone of the piece, as well as avoiding more of the transliterational traps that Keene seems to fall into. Indeed, Sansom not only knew Japanese, but a number of regional dialects and forms, and thus goes beyond merely an academic understanding of Kenko's idioms and sayings. The essays are part of a small but highly influential Japanese literary tradition known in English as follow the pen, in effect a kind of stream of consciousness style of writing. This style is marked by a deep contempt for contemporaries felt by the authors, and an automatically reactionary yearning for more ordered times. The work's title is derived from the aforementioned preface, reading in Sansom's translation, "To while away the idle hours, seated the livelong day before the ink slab, by jotting down without order or purpose whatever trifling thoughts pass through my mind. Truly, this is a queer and crazy thing to do." Kenko's essays give us perhaps the clearest example of intertwined aesthetic metaphysical philosophy, something we must seek to remaster in the West if we want to write any worthwhile philosophy at all. This is a trait common to most good Japanese writers and artists, perhaps because Japan is a country where enormous natural disasters are relatively commonplace, and whole cities can be swept away in less than a day. Hence, what Gomez Davila called the sensual perfection of the moment becomes vitally important, because the next moment may be the one that destroys what currently exists. Kenko, in the Buddhist tradition, gives a great deal of thought to the impermanence of the material, in particular how this affects beauty. He argues that the beauty of nature lies fundamentally in its impermanence. The earliest mentions of this concept come with a quote from an early Japanese poet who wrote, "It is only after the silk wrapper has frayed at top and bottom, and the mother of pearl has fallen from the roller, that a scroll looks beautiful." Indeed, taking this idea to its conclusion, Kenko argues that if man were materially immortal, then everything would cease to matter, and all beauty would lose its power. The most precious thing in life is uncertainty. Furthermore, he draws from this idea to argue that a sense of incompleteness in the beginnings and ends of things is a superior quality. It is only a person of poor understanding who wishes to arrange things in complete sets, he writes. It is incompleteness that is desirable. He draws frequent allegories to the moon, hidden by clouds, or the blossoms waiting for spring to appear. I have suggested for some time that a community such as ours should not shy away from the production of art. And what better inspires great works than the yearning for what we worry may never return? What if we should never come to see the blossoms waiting for spring, or the moon hidden by the clouds, again? In a personalistic way, Kenko argues that persons of quality are those with a sensitivity to beauty and refinement. This gives him a natural preference for the aristocracy, but not exclusively so. This sense is a key part of what drives the hierarchies of traditional societies, and one absolutely vital to maintaining dignity in the modern world, when so much ugliness and boorishness surrounds us. This is yet another thing touched on with great frequency: the beauty of order. Whether in the correct observance of courtly rituals, or the correct arrangement of objects in a household, order on the microscopic level is what gives rise to order on a grand scale. As a vital digression, something else we might learn from an author like Kenko is quality of thought. Even those among us who purport to be cultivated and gentlemanly are given to filling their remarks with vulgarity, vagueness, and stupidities. It does not matter whether Kenko is admonishing a ruffian he saw at the marketplace, or relating an anecdote of Confucius. He treats the subject with nobility, clarity, and intelligence at all times. He was by profession a poet, and it shows. The same goes for so many invaluable authors of the reactionary canon. If you cannot express your thoughts poetically, then you should study poetry until you understand how to do so. So many prominent members of our community study history, philosophy, political science, economics, etc., but lack any kind of aesthetic underpinning to lubricate their thoughts. Neglecting poetry and classics while making pronouncements on the nature of man is akin to making judgments on music that you've listened to with your fingers in your ears. The exact antidote to modernity is nobility, hence the lack of such a thing. When we can begin to express great truths poetically like Kenko, we will be worthy of our reactionary heritage. As a final reflection on the essays, it is worth remembering that dwelling on the degeneracy of our times is a vain act. In many ways there have been better, and in many ways there have been worse. What use is lamenting our own times if we do not properly understand what fueled the better ones?